Thanks. Oh, yeah. Just while Simon's doing the slides, so thanks for those kind words, Werner. And a huge thanks to Werner, Simon, Roger, and everyone who's enabled this to happen. It's a delight to come over here to England. I was actually born in England, but I am pretty much Dublin Irish in general terms. So Werner gave a brief summary there of kind of my background. It was actually in 2012 where I had these poor blood test results, and I began to research, and I've spent the last 7 years. And in the last few years, I'm actually working for Irish Heart Disease Awareness, which is a charity to try and get the message out on prevention of heart disease, but the correct message as opposed to the more orthodox one. And David Bobbitt is an Irish entrepreneur who's put in $5 million approximately into this with zero return. It's all philanthropy. So I'm delighted to represent ihda.ie here. So I'm going to go through my own story first in a little detail, not because I want to be self-indulgent, but there are quite a few learnings in there. So here was me back in 2012, and I'm just going to mention 3 blood tests. Cholesterol, you should be below 5 millimoles, your total cholesterol. Serum ferritin is iron loading in the blood. You should be maybe around 200. And serum GGT is a liver enzyme. So don't worry about the names, but it's a liver kind of marker. And that's where you should be. But when I got standard blood tests, nothing wrong with me, just generic, I came in there for GGT, 112, and I got a retest later. And I came in up there for serum ferritin, and I have family members who are similar now, but now I know why. And my cholesterol as well was quite high at 6.8. So the doctor is obviously concerned, but not overly so. And that interested me. But because I have 25 years of leading complex problem solving teams, I'm a biochemical engineer, so in engineering and corporate, I have a way of immediately grilling or interviewing any expert where there's an issue. And obviously this one is close to my heart. So I began to grill the first doctor. And basically they had a vague idea but had no clarity on 2 key questions in any technical problem. The first question is, what factors influence this problem data? What kind of root causes in my environment or nutrition would cause these to go high so I can go and fix them? And the second question is, what are the implications of these bad readings for morbidity or mortality or disease? Obviously they mean something, otherwise you wouldn't test them. And the answers were very weak. And I recognized immediately, even though I didn't know all the technology around these, I recognized the answers were very weak and vague. I went to a second doctor, a more senior person, connected through my friends, and got similar weak answers on both questions. And I eventually went to a very senior person, a very high level. A little better, but similarly nowhere near what I'd expect from experts in standard tests, which are their realm. It's their area of expertise. These are standard blood tests. I should get the answers. So it was suggested I might have hemochromatosis, which is an iron loading disease. Got the test, I didn't. For the GGT, it was suggested, maybe alcohol, too much alcohol, GGT goes up. But it wasn't that. I had a few glasses of wine, maybe some days, couple another, 1 other days. I knew for my body size that couldn't be the cause, instinctively. And the cholesterol, they were saying, well, maybe you're eating too much fat. Eat more healthy whole grains. But the reality was, none of them really had a clue to my standard, and I knew that instinctively. So something occurred to me and popped into my head right then after all this experience. And basically it was, wow. Here are 3 medical professionals, all good guys, varying seniority, and none of them have a grasp of basic measures of their trade. And I knew that must mean there's something huge in this. How can this be? I didn't know yet how huge it was, but I knew there's something massive here. So I said, I'm going to go and dig for my own benefit too, because I have 5 children and these readings are absurd. So when the experts don't know, you research. And luckily I had a log on through my corporation to ResearchGate, which has the last 100 years of human, animal and biochemical research on all these things. So I began to look up ferritin. You can see there's 10,000 plus papers and studies on ferritin. There's around billion on cholesterol, but you can go and research the science if you're an expert problem solver and a technical person. So I did. And basically, I discovered quite quickly on cholesterol, and I'm going to go back one there, wondering about this high cholesterol, but I quickly found studies on humans, like the Hunt study from, I think it was Norway, and they had 60,000 men and women tracked over 20 years. And what they saw was, the higher the cholesterol, right up to 7 and above, the higher the cholesterol for women meant lower mortality, with no exception. And for cardiovascular mortality, it was the same, and that's all cause, which is the important one. Higher cholesterol, lower mortality, no exception. And for men, it was largely the same. And there were quite a few more studies I won't show you, but within a week or two, I knew that cholesterol, well, A, I wasn't worried about mine, and B, I knew the whole thing on cholesterol was completely ridiculous. I went on to research for years, and I've given lectures on advanced lipoprotein and cholesterol transport and metabolism. But to be honest, in the first week or two, I knew that cholesterol was pretty much useless as a marker, which is quite shocking. It takes a week or two. So, cholesterol is a weapon of mass distraction. It's not completely irrelevant, right? Because when you have problems in your body, your cholesterol numbers can often reflect those problems. So it's an indirect proxy, right? But it's largely no good to an engineer. An engineer needs real measures. So let's get on to real measures. Serum GGT, the liver enzyme I mentioned, and I'm up through the roof. Very quickly, I find studies like this. People in the top quarter of GGT in the population, the top 25% people, they have 7 times the risk for coronary artery disease. Now, if you're high cholesterol, you might have 1.2 times. On a good day, 7 times. So this is a serious measure, and you can see there the tight error bars. And for the statisticians out there, it means it's an extremely tight, strong relationship. So ferritin's huge. And also I'm thinking, wow, I'm in trouble. Another study here, or sorry, that was GGT, another study in GGT, and briefly, for my BMI of 30-31, not too fat at the time, around 14.89 stone maybe. For my BMI, the top quarter of GGT in the population, again, 15 times the risk for future type 2 diabetes. 15 times the risk. Think about that. So I'm looking at this data and I'm going, oh my God, what have I done? Liver cancer. I'll cut to the chase. Liver is the most important organ in your body, pretty much, next to heart and brain. It does amazing stuff. But liver cancer death, if you're up in the top 5th of people of GGT, 19 times the risk for death from hepatoma or liver cancer. These are huge risks I was carrying, right? They make cholesterol just a joke. So I'll show you serum ferritin now. I'm up here. Same thing. For atherosclerosis, the vascular disease that causes most heart attacks, if you're up in the top 5th of people in serum ferritin, you have 5 times the risk. Right? 10 times the risk of carotid atherosclerosis done with the ultrasound in this study. And I had loads of studies. It literally only took a couple of weeks to realize GGT and ferritin are enormously important, and cholesterol is a distraction largely, because cholesterol numbers only kind of go bad when you've got something real going on under the hood. That's in essence. So here was me in Singapore. I was a little fatter there, obviously, and I was pretty angry young man. And I was on a business trip, but it was just after I discovered what I just showed you. And I was very angry, I mean, genuinely. And some Singaporean engineer captured this photo. And I don't know I was thinking about this, but I'm guessing I was. So I'm thinking, right, I got to root cause this now fully. So I know what these measures mean and how serious they are, but I'm going to have to go to the second question. How do I intervene and fix the numbers? Because I know it's possible. I'm not a mutant. I don't have high numbers just because I got some genetic perversion in my coding. It's not realistic. It's not logical. I'm doing this to myself. So let's find out what. So I hit the books hard for the next couple of months. This is not physically my office. This is a photo from the web, but it was a bit like this. And my wife, Eilish, was wondering, wow, what's going on? You are like a dog with a bone. But I was, because I was going to find out, hell or high water. And after a while, Eilish was actually happy because she realized I explained to her I'd found the causes and I was going to fix them. And I was certain. So I said, okay, probably correct. So what I did was I took my diet, and I'm going to give you an idea of my diet. Now, we have traditional cooking, meat, fish and eggs in the house. Occasionally we had pizzas at the time, and we were using vegetable oils, which is bad news. Bad news. But generally there was good fat and protein and real food. We weren't eating junk. In fairness, I was eating chocolate here and there, and I drank a lot of orange juice, which is pretty much pure sugar. The nutrients you get in orange juice don't come within a mile of matching up for the fact that it's full of pure liquid sugar. So remember the liver we talked about earlier? It's as bad as alcohol for your liver. And I would be casually eating sweets. I was not trying to reduce sugar at all. So in fairness, I wasn't great there. And I was certainly eating excessive carbohydrate. And an important point is, we know this is sugar, and we try and reduce it, right? Soft drinks, everyone knows bad for you. Sugar. Teaspoons of sugar in your tea. Sugar's bad. Everyone knows that. What they don't realize is this stuff is essentially the same. So breads, rice, pastas, certainly mashed potatoes, not so bad if they're just boiled and eaten with the skins. These are all stuffed with glucose, and they're refined carbohydrate products that are mostly glucose, that as soon as you eat it, it just becomes glucose in your blood. So you're giving yourself a high glucose, high sugar hit with these crappy modern foods. Now the potato's old, I know, but again, a boiled potato with the skin's not too bad, but nowadays we have mashed potato chips, chip potatoes, crisps. It's a different world now. I was having a couple of glasses of wine, probably with dinner each evening, and I switched based on my research and said, I'm going to switch and I'm going to change all these metrics. And what I switched to was a high healthy fat, moderate protein, low carb diet. Now what did this look like? I certainly accentuated the real foods, real ancestral evolutionary foods. The reason Homo sapiens is here, the reason we're talking to each other, all right, and the reason we've developed all this technology is from eating real nutrient dense animal foods. Largely is what brought Homo sapiens to where we are. Also, avocados are a very high fat, healthy plant food. Sardines I began to eat for fish and omega-3 because I was discovering all about the benefits. Olives are a high fat food. Butter's fine. That was all a lie about the butter. And I switched to olive oil from the vegetable oils because I began to find out how damaging these are to the human cellular structure. These are highly refined seed oils, crushed from seeds like sunflower or the canola, high temperatures, pressures. They use hexane and solvents. They have to deoserize, they have to bleach, right? They have to color them. These are highly refined, modern processed foods, vegetable oils. That's an important point. Olive oil is just crushed from real fruit. It's fine. Coconut oil is fine because it's crushed from coconuts. It's real food, just crushed. So there's that, and cream, double cream in my coffee instead of milk and stuff like that. Cut out all of these, that's a no-brainer, and switch to high cocoa chocolate, which actually has a lot of things in it that are good for you, and it's a good treat, and it's relatively low sugar. And then lots of non-starchy vegetables. So you can see all these vegetables here, they are low sugar. And the berry fruits, they're low sugar, relatively, like strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries. They're relatively low sugar and high fiber. But the modern apples, oranges are bred for sugar. They're very sweet now compared to hundreds of years ago. And they're relatively high sugar. And rice and potatoes I brought right down. Didn't eliminate them, but small portions of rice. I used to have large portions soaked with sauces. Right? Because carbohydrate that's refined in someone who puts on weight and begins to have problems, it's compelling and addictive. It screams more. It drives appetite. So I managed these down to low levels. So that's kind of what I did, a classic low carb. I kept drinking the same amount of wine because I didn't want my experiment to be confounded by also lowering alcohol. I wanted to keep that constant, right? I wanted to see what the food did alone. But also I enjoyed this, and also my research said that there's no way this was it at all. So I said, I'm going to do this. And basically I switched to this food pyramid, which is the other one that they tell us, but it's inverted. So you've got vegetables down the bottom, no problem, but very near the base you have a lot of nutrient-dense meat, fish and eggs. You know, real ancestral human foods, low sugar, full of nutrients. And then you've got low sugar fruits, and then you can certainly don't go crazy on fats and nuts. They're very energy dense, but no problem. Dairy, little bit of a problem for some people, but generally it's fine. And legumes, you know, like beans and all, legumes can be problematic for people, and there are a lot of carb in them, so not too much. Grains, very little. So refined grains, wheats, all these things, really bad. So that's the pyramid I did. So what happened? So in engineering, you find out what happens. So 112 there for GGT, the most important measure. Did that, only that, no extra exercise, everything fixed, just the food, and did it. And in 6 weeks, I went in and got a blood test again. And I come down to 42. Not too surprised. Now, Dr. David Unwin, who you know, I met him years later and became great friends, but he loves GGT, and he also discovered GGT was the key. And he has published papers now on his patients, same kind of thing. GGT is the one to watch. He says if they're low carb and they begin to cheat, he'll know by their GGT figure. He'll just go back up again. You see, you're cheating. So anyway, down to 42. 2 weeks later, I wanted the verification. Well, guess what? It had actually, at 8 weeks, dropped even further, right down to mid-range, right? Kept dropping. That's just food, just food. But my ferritin came down to 230 into range in the same 8 weeks. My cholesterol, the number for your bad cholesterol and your total doesn't really matter, just the number, but the ratios when you divide your cholesterol numbers together do mean something. I knew that they were important ones. They got way better, the ratios. Blood pressure had always been hypertensive. The docs kind of said, probably should take meds, right? That collapsed down. The weight, 95 down to 83 in that period of 8.5 weeks approximately. But importantly, the blood pressure collapsed quickly in the first week before any weight came off. So people will say, oh, well, when you lose weight, your blood pressure gets better. Yes, because you're fixing your metabolic disease that drives blood pressure, which is high insulin, mainly blood insulin. But it's not the weight that causes the blood pressure. It's the insulin problems that cause the weight and the blood pressure. So important to note, your blood pressure will drop much faster than the weight comes off. And the waist came down quite pleasingly, so happy enough with that. That kind of dramatic change in metrics only happens when you find primary root cause. So in engineering, if you find a mitigating factor, like medications are kind of mitigating things that help a bit. They help, they nudge numbers, they reduce rates of disease a little. They're not root cause. That dramatic transformation in 8 weeks, that only happens when you got the root cause. We did have the root cause. We know what the root cause is. The modern disease epidemic is built on refined carbohydrate, sugars, and vegetable oils. That's the unholy triad. And the problem is, you can put away the vegetable oil bottle, and you can put away the sugar and the sugary drinks. But these three ingredients are in nearly all the processed food that makes up most of the supermarket. The sauces, the packaged foods, you know, obviously all the breads. All of our food supply now has those three components. And if you look at the ingredients list, you'll see that up in the top 5, you're going to see various vegetable oils and you're going to see grains. So we've kind of poisoned our whole food supply with foods that we think are actually okay. They're not really. They're not really. Real foods are okay. But real foods are either meat, fish and eggs or vegetables. Everything outside that, you're into the boonies, sadly. So here's what bad food looks like. Breads, you know, if you're insulin sensitive, young, fit, you can eat a certain amount of bread and you'll be okay. But as you get older, if you want to stay healthy, bad refined carbohydrate with vegetable oils. Chocolate, obviously, I just put in to show, obviously sweets are bad. But all these rolls, people have lunch rolls, all these cereal bars that are popular, bagels, these are all refined carbohydrates with a massive shot of vegetable oil in there too, right? Orange juice became very popular in the last 20, 30 years. very in moderation. It's not the end of the world, but now it's in 2-litre cartons and people glug it. It's basically got as much sugar as Coke, and the nutrients in it don't make up for the sugar. Vegetable oils, I don't need to say anymore, and all the margarines. Hopefully you've seen margarine is dropping in popularity, because what I'm saying is beginning to get out there to the wider audience. You'll see a lot of discounting on margarine, and I think you should have a discount on poison, because you know, you should not be charging premium for something that hurts you. And cereals, oh my God. I mean, the cereals were immediately banished 7 years ago from our larder. We had cereals every morning. We thought they were healthy cereals with fibre. Complete scam, they're glucose. Glucose. Pasta, pretty much the same. If you do traditional pasta, like the Italians, with a lot of egg and protein, it slows down the sugar absorption from this pasta, which is mostly glucose, and it's not as bad. And the Italians traditionally had a small bowl of pasta as a starter, and then they had their main meal with real foods. So the Italians actually weren't too bad with their pasta, but now what do you get? You go into a restaurant, get a pasta dish, you get a massive bowl of pasta and a little miserable bit of meat and thrown through it. That's a big bowl of sugar, essentially. So, and they're not even high egg pasta with protein. A lot of them are now very processed, and of course they're cheap. Cheap manufacturing, race to the bottom. The cheapest junk is in the processed foods. So you eliminate those, and I'm not saying it's easy, because there's a hugely addictive nature to these foods. We have 100 years of the food business designing foods to scream more to you, a human. There's technology in this. They're not idiots. They want you to eat more. They make them as palatable, hyper palatable as possible, and make your body react as much as possible, generally. So it's not easy, but you have to eliminate them. You replace them with what? Well, with real food. Evolutionary foods. Foods that are actually taken from the ground as actual real food that we could have eaten 1,000 years ago. And of course, all the meats and everything we evolved on that grew the human brain. So a lot of these real foods are actually quite high in fat. But if you don't eat the refined carbohydrates and you don't eat all of this, then the fat is healthy and you can burn it in a healthy way. The problem that kind of framed some of the fatty foods was everyone in the modern 60s and 70s, when they were trying to figure this out, was eating real foods mixed with breads and processed foods. And the two together are not a good mix. Refined carbohydrate mixed with actual real fats, good foods, it kind of makes the good fats not behave so well. Because when you're eating a lot of carbohydrate, your body has to deal with that sugar immediately. And the fatty foods you're eating with it kind of get backed up in your bloodstream. That's a simplistic analogy, but that's kind of what's happening. So always remember, the healthy fatty foods are healthy in the absence of the problem foods. You can't start eating these and stuff yourself while keep eating those. You know, so that's a dangerous trap that someone could fall into, but no one in the low carb movement, in fairness, they know what I'm saying. So they are the foods, right? And exercise is important too for health, generally, but you won't outrun a bad diet. So if you're eating all the bad foods, the exercise will lower your risk, it will help you, it won't overcome. You can't counteract this kind of stuff. This has caused so much damage to the human race the last 50 years. You can't out-exercise it. There are a few key vitamins and minerals too, but generally it's the real food is the important thing. But certainly potassium is something that's very important, and we're getting less of it. Magnesium is super important for heart health and a lot of other things. And there are estimates that up to 80% of people possibly now are magnesium deficient. And magnesium in vegetables, a recent study showed the level of magnesium in above ground vegetables in the US, from the US Department of Agriculture, has gone down 8 times in the last 40 years. So it's nearly gone down 10x, or an order of magnitude. So magnesium we know is a huge issue. And of course, people are not eating fish anymore for the important omega-3 fats and DHA, EPA. So that's kind of a very high-level summary of what we're doing wrong and where we need to go. The second half we'll get into in a while. I'll go into some myths that hopefully you'll find very interesting. But long story short, after I discovered the core of what I told you there, I went ahead to give talks all around the world based on continued research into cholesterol, atherosclerosis, calcification, everything around human health. But in the second half, we'll go through some medical and nutritional myths which I've picked up over the last few years. And I'm going to pick 6 of the big ones. One of them will be cholesterol, but there's some others too. And I'll kind of give you basic evidence explaining why they're myths, even though most doctors will believe most of these 6. But I'll let you see what you think. The whole body of science in nutrition and medicine is one huge jigsaw, and it's a huge jigsaw to solve every piece, to have the ultimate longevity, productivity, vitality up to a very old age for your genetics. It's a huge puzzle because there's so many vitamins, minerals, you know, food choices, exercise options. So many things to work out the full jigsaw. It's complex, but I'm going to pick 6 big pieces of the jigsaw that are really important principles and show you how the orthodoxy sadly got them all wrong. And then you can infer from these 6, when you put them together, that are central to health. If they got those 6 wrong, you know, it's not like we disbelieve everything, but just to realize when you read stuff in the newspaper or some professor in some university says something, unless someone analyzes that person and checks what he's done or she's done, unfortunately, yes, experts are more likely to be correct about something than a non-expert on average. But industry and economics and a lot of groupthink over the last 40 years have left us with some powerfully incorrect paradigms that are still there. So we'll look at a few of them. Now I'm going to introduce, I'm going to give these guys a report card at the end as well. We'll see how they did. You know, they had 30, 40 years and billions of dollars to work on these 6 things. And I figured I could have done better with a lot less money, but you know, let's give them a report card. They deserve to be judged. So the first one is coronary artery calcification is not an ideal test. And I'll send a link later to a free movie, The Widowmaker, which David Bobbitt, my sponsor, got made for $2 million to tell the story of this amazing scan. But the whole cardiology business hates it for many professional and economic reasons, but let's see, is it not an ideal test? So here's the scan, 5 minutes, you slide in, middle-aged, middle-risk person can find out immediately what's going on inside. A couple of hundred sterling, maybe 300, insurance won't cover it usually, but a simple scan. The guy on the left there has no calcium in his coronary vascular arteries. Okay, so that's my buddy, Dr. Gerber, co-author of the book over there. And at 54, he gets a 0 score in this 5-minute scan. That means he has essentially a 15-year warranty, even at 54, because his all-cause mortality will be so low compared to the average person for the next 15 years. Many papers call it a warranty. It's not 100%, but it's just amazing. No calcium not only means effectively no heart disease worth talking about, but it also means you're at far lower risk for cancers and many other diseases because they're all driven by the same thing. So a 0 is amazing. This person on the right, unidentified, that's the Widowmaker there, massive calcification. The scan sees it immediately. That's a high scoring person. That person is a high risk patient. Doesn't matter whether they have low cholesterol, high cholesterol, blood pressure, doesn't matter what their numbers are. If you got calcium in there, you have driven progressive vascular disease for a decade or more, and you are at super high risk. This scan tells you that immediately. IHDA.ie, we have all the scan centres, America, UK, Ireland and Canada, and we're building up a map of the whole world where you can get these scans done. They vary in price per country, but you'll see a page there, scan centres on IHDA.ie, so you can see where they are. X-ray risk, you will hear cardiologists even, not all my cardiologist friends, but you'll hear cardiologists saying, and doctors, oh, there's risk radiation. Complete junk. The X-ray dose you get from a modern scan like this, in the radiation risk calculator, world authorities, it gives you a theoretical extra 1 in 20,000 risk over the remainder of life for a 50-year-old person of something problematic, which is 0 because it's theoretical. I interviewed the professor of physics who designed this machine 30 years ago, and we went through Hiroshima and everything. He said 1 millisievert is a joke. But they bring it up because they don't like the scan for reasons shown in the Widowmaker movie. So, all presidents, like this guy, I express no opinions. All American presidents in the last 15 years or so, and all astronauts must have a calcium scan before they take office or go into space. So that gives you the answer. They must have a calcium scan, because the calcium scan is what will tell the authorities the reality. But no one else gets it, no one knows about it. But everyone is entitled to what they're entitled to, especially for a simple technology that's 30 years old, albeit suppressed. So I'll show you roughly the risks without getting data heavy. And this is one study, but there are hundreds of human studies. They all say the same thing. I have a folder 4 inches thick at home of human calcification studies, and you've probably never heard of it. 4 inches thick. So this study showed that with a 0 score, no matter what age the people were, their rate in the next 10 years of heart attacks was really low. It's not 0, because even with no calcium, you can have electrical problems in your heart. You can have other stuff going on. You could even have some plaque that's there that's not calcified, one big one, and it doesn't show. But look, it's really low. It's incredibly low. If you have a score of 1 to 100, it means you have quite a bit of calcium. This is a range thing. You have 5 times approximately the risk of a heart attack in the next 10 years. Now remember, if you have high blood pressure, you might have 1.5 times the risk. Yeah, it's a risk factor. Cholesterol, to be honest, cholesterol's so noisy I wouldn't even use it. But if your cholesterol ratios are bad, your total divided by your HDL good, if that's very high ratios, you know, you might have a 1.5 times risk. But the point is, this is 5 times for this score. And if you have a high score, my sponsor at 960 at 52, you've around 20 times the risk of a heart attack in the next 10 years. No matter what age you are, it doesn't matter. So the biggest risk for heart attacks is age, naturally. You know, the older you are, the chance of a heart attack goes much, much higher, because we all age and we degenerate in ways, and disease progresses. But to emphasize, a 50-year-old with a high score, same as my sponsors, and these people are walking all over the place out there. They don't know, because they never get scanned. A lot of them have low cholesterol, their blood pressure looks okay. Has 20 times the risk in the next 10 years of a heart attack as a 70 or 80-year-old with a 0. And I know some of these guys as well. 20 times the risk for that guy. You look at that guy, right? You've bumped into these people, you just don't know it. Someone drops dead, 51 years old, 3 kids, wasn't really overweight much, seemed healthy, cholesterol was low. I've met a lot of those. And next minute he drops dead. And everyone goes, oh, he didn't smoke, he was slim. But he was probably diabetic. And we'll get onto that topic soon, without knowing it. But these tragedies happen all the time. People go, oh, you know, well, who can know? It's fate. No, he never got a scan. Had he got a scan, he would have seen calcium up the wazoo. And then could have got medications, lifestyle change, and prevented the heart attack. But no one's using this scan. So David, as I say, Bob, my sponsor, 2012, he got this huge score. And they just gave him a drug and just said, oh, whatever. And then he went and researched it, and then a week later, he just could not believe, he was enraged that no one has the chance to find out they have disease in this simple scan. And that's why he's put millions of dollars in, and he founded ihda.ie. So basically, the key is to slow or stop progression. So there's no point finding out you have a big score and then going, oh, I'm doomed. You're not doomed. A high score means you're right this day with a high score, you're at huge risk. Obviously, I've shown you, massive risk. If you stop that score rising fast, because most people don't know their score and they just keep rising without knowing it. They keep eating bread and stuff, right? And then they have a heart attack. But if you know your score is high and you intervene and do some of the things we're talking about, you can actually slow and even stop the progression. And then your risk plummets. Plummets. So here in this study, they had people, middle-aged, who had a very high score. Over the years, though, they scanned them several times, and they were rising at more than 15% a year. So think like 600, and the next year it's 780. The next year it's like 890. It's rising at more than 15% a year. And you can probably imagine, if you're driving this calcium, which is the disease process, fast, you're at high risk. 50% of that group had heart attacks. 1 in 2, right? Which is just obviously shocking, but they got measured, and that's how you get to see this. Otherwise, you'd never know. In the same study, they had people with the same high scores at the start, but over the 5 years, their calcium was rising slowly. So maybe they were, say, 5 or say 600, like the last example, but then they were only 670, only 11% up the following year. And then they went to 740, right? So they're slow progressors. They achieved that somehow. Do you think that they had a lower rate of heart disease? You'd guess so if what I'm saying is true. Do you think they had half the rate? They still, what do people think, quarter the rate? How about 17 times lower rate? So this is the Raji study, but in general these studies show an 8 times lower on average across studies rate of heart attacks, even with high scores, when you slow progression. So slowing progression is what it's all about, but the first thing is obviously to know you've got a high score, really. So this guy, William Davis, one of the only published guys, he's a cardiologist. I've interviewed him a couple of times. And he did a multi-factor intervention. And he did what I would do. Well, I would do more, and so would he, but you're not allowed to do human studies and do everything you want because they're used to drug studies. You only have one drug versus placebo. They don't actually want to let you do what you must do to stop heart disease, a multi-factor intervention. That's low carb, vitamin D, magnesium, potassium. That's what an engineer would do. It would fix all the problems and then get an amazing result. But he was allowed to do a few things. He did a little bit of lipid lowering, you know, kind of statin. He did omega-3. He did vitamin D. And he also did magnesium, and he did a low carb diet in this study. Okay? So he did some good things. And he only got, out of 45 people over 3 years, he only got a few that actually progressed the normal rapid rate. Half of them had slow progression, which is relatively safe, and half of them actually showed regression. No one else had ever in medical history done this, and no one's actually studied it since. I guess no one's interested, but he did it. William Davis told me that in 08-09, when he started working out low carb and realizing that most heart disease was diabetes and that grains were the biggest problem in our modern food supply, he began to apply this. And he said in all of his patients who were compliant and followed his multi-factor intervention, which is basically like I have in the book, he said he eliminated second heart attacks or heart attacks in his patients. He went from having 3 a.m. call-outs, and he was an interventional cardiologist. He used to do 10 stents and 10 people in a day. He said it all ended. I basically put myself out of business. None of my patients who listened to me really ever had heart attacks again in the next 7, 8, 9 years. So it's anecdotal, but we're hearing this from Ross Walker, cardiologist in Australia as well, another guy I interviewed, and his name escapes me, in Wisconsin. But the thing is, there are some cardiologists doing what I'm talking about and doing all the things, fixing all the root causes. What's happening? They're just basically eliminating the heart attacks in their population. They've become pure preventative, right? But you just won't hear this because there's so few of them. But there will be more, to that gentleman earlier. I think in the next 10 years we're going to see a lot more of this. In fact, we've made a movie about this topic, and it'll be released in the next month or two, hopefully. An Irish movie. We've scanned a load of sports stars, 45 of them, saw some shocking scores in people who were told they were completely healthy. And we also got a few people to go on this regime, and they had some quite stunning success in stopping the calcification over the next year. So anyway, that's coming. So on ihda.ie, you'll see that the guidelines are now saying to use this scan. And that's an orthodox medical guy on Medscape. We have a 1-minute video there. We are not saying use something that's not in the guidelines. It's actually now in the guidelines. But no one knows about it, and your doctor will say no. You know, because it takes 20 years for the medical profession to actually kind of move forward. It's glacial, but it's coming. So that's it. Coronary artery calcification is not an ideal test. This is a very powerful message, and you'll hear it all across the NHS, and in Ireland, and in America. It's completely wrong. And hopefully the data I've shown you, it's self-evidently wrong. Any engineer who is looking at reducing the failure rate of heart in production units, people, would be using the scan on every production line. It's a no-brainer. And yet, the industry fights against it. And also, if you scan everyone, you'll take more people off statins than you'll put on. So the pharmaceutical industry has rejected this and suppressed it 30 years ago. Because the way the dynamics work, there's at least half people on a big report published last year on statins that have a 0 score. That means they should not be on them. There is no benefit. So there's a lot of politics in this. Cholesterol, key cause of heart disease. This is the one, Werner, probably a key one for people. So I'm going to show what I mentioned there. This paper in 2009, and what this guy Ware did, he did what I tried to do, and I only found 3 human studies with calcification and cholesterol. And all 3 said cholesterol doesn't even correlate or even line up with the degree of disease. He got 20. So he wrote this paper. And basically, he has 20 why questions covering the 20 human studies. And every one of them says, why does cholesterol not correlate or link up at all with the degree of arterial disease as measured by the best possible measure, the calcium scan? And it just doesn't. And the reason is it's not really much of a risk factor. I liked a few of them. Here's one paper, why for adults with familial hypercholesterolemia, super high cholesterol, did this study find that age-adjusted coronary calcium scores were not associated even with cholesterol levels? They didn't even line up with them at all. There was no relationship as assessed by any statistical method. St. Francis Heart Study, it's actually quite a famous heart study, and the correlation, no correlation between LDL levels and the calcium scores in 5,000 people. And why do studies that look for correlation between total or LDL in the progression of atherosclerosis find no significant association? That's a cluster of 10 calcium studies in humans. They just don't. Now, cholesterol. So how did it all go wrong? Here's the biggest study ever, 1948, the Framingham Heart Study, the biggest human heart study. It's still running in the town of Framingham, Massachusetts. And they looked at cholesterol and heart attacks and death. But you know what the director, William P. Castelli, cardiologist and data expert, he was honest. And he published this paper in 1991. And he said, unless your LDL, that's your bad cholesterol, right? If it's over 3, your doctor will be worried. Unless LDL levels are very high, 7.8 millimole or higher, they're American units, they have no value in isolation in predicting those individuals at risk for coronary disease. So an engineer looks at that and says, okay, unless your LDL is over 8, anyone here with their LDL over 8 millimoles? It's so rare. But Castelli said it, unless it's over 8, it has no value in predicting on its own. Funny, isn't it? That's published. That's a direct quote. He also said that the total divided by your HDL good cholesterol, the ratio, was found to be a better predictor of coronary disease than total, the LDL, the HDL, or the triglyceride. You also get that off your doctor in your panel. Not only in Framing itself, but also in the Physician's Health Study and many other studies, in fact all other studies. It's the cholesterol ratios that predict the problem and not the LDL bad cholesterol. That's why it's not used in any of the risk calculators. It's a medication target because you can watch the little number go down when you take drugs and it helps show if they're working, but it's not a risk factor. So, why? And here it is in a nutshell. Insulin resistance and high blood insulin and blood glucose and diabetic type problems are vastly the highest driver of heart disease in the world, right? That's just the way it is. There's other drivers, but these blood glucose and insulin problems, David Unwin and everyone else is talking about all over the world now, they're the big show in town. They're the elephant in the room, right? LDL's the mouse. They're the big driver. They're what we should be working on. However, insulin resistance causes your HDL good cholesterol to go down and your LDL often and your smaller LDL particles to go up. So in the big root cause of heart disease actually causes the cholesterol numbers to change. And that's why the ratios predict. It's not because of cholesterol, it's because the big problem has caused these numbers to change. This is a proxy. The ratios in the risk algorithms using cholesterol numbers, they're just predicting insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. It's not really about cholesterol at all. But the narrative has to be cholesterol because we have interventions that lower the LDL. So it has to be about that. So I'll show you an illustration, and this one I think you'll like because it occurred to me around a year and a half ago. Hold on a minute. I know what I just told you is true, and I know that the world's 5 risk algorithms that predict your risk and decide whether you go on drugs or not. No doctor should be giving you drugs based on LDL. They should be using a risk calculator that they have on their computer. QRisk 3 in England, QRisk 2, QRisk 3, Framingham in America, there's a few more of them. I'll show you them. They should be using the risk calculator and putting in your HDL, your total, your blood pressure, your diabetes status. That's what they should be doing by law or by practice. So we've got risk calculators, and I knew they're pretty good. And I knew they were pretty good because they predict your insulin resistance. And it occurred to me then, hold on a minute. I should put in a guy, 50 years old, right, middle-aged man, high-risk guy, into the risk calculator, a total of 8 total cholesterol, which is huge. You're only going to admit 1 in 100 people is going to be that, if that. A total of 8 and an LDL more than 5. Which again, it's huge. But the reality is here, if we put this person in the world's 5 risk algorithms, but we put in the other numbers such that he is not insulin resistant, what happens? This super high LDL guy comes out as low risk in the UK and American risk algorithms. Standard of care to check risk. Huge LDL, low risk. And all I had to do was put in a high HDL, good cholesterol, right? Normal blood pressure. In other words, not on medications for hypertension. In other words, I put in the numbers such that this person was not insulin resistant. And the high LDL means nothing. And these are the world's risk calculators. These are not mine. These are done over 30 years, developed by mathematicians, actuaries. They're actually quite predictive. I didn't make them up, but I just proved that high LDL, just like Castelli said in 1991, it doesn't mean anything if you're not insulin resistant or have some other issue. And if the person, this middle-aged person, was smart enough to get a calcium scan, and certainly with a high LDL, if a doctor wants to scaremonger him, bloody should get a calcium scan to find out if he actually has disease and look inside, but gets a 0, like many of them will, in the algorithms from NASA, AstroCharm and MESA that use the calcium score, you put in a 0, they come out as ultra low risk with the super high LDL. The lowest risk you can be as a human at 50. You can't be lower than 0.9. And that person is a huge LDL. So hopefully you can internalize the world's risk algorithms prove what Castelli said without me having to convince you. A high LDL effectively doesn't mean anything unless you have a concurrent or a genuine problem metabolically, most of which will be insulin and glucose, but there are other ones too. So high LDL cholesterol is kind of a factor, but you need to look at the person and all the other measures of health and inflammatory markers to find out if it even matters. No doctor in England is doing that, except for, of course, Unwin and a bunch of others, but generally not. So do people internalize that cholesterol as a key cause of heart disease is just fundamentally wrong? It has a part to play, but analysing whether a high cholesterol has any importance requires expertise that sadly no doctor has. It's got a part to play, but it's complex and you cannot look at your LDL and know what's going on without going deeper. Meat causes cancer, diabetes, all that. I hear this all the time, you know, game changers, right? They actually say that meat causes type 2 diabetes. I mean, you couldn't make this up. The Indians, the Inuit and all, were eating like masses of buffalo and practically all meat diets, and there was 0 diabetes for millennia. And now in the last 40 years, diabetes explodes just when vegetable oil, sugars and refined carbs come in, and meat's actually gone down, red meat's gone down. But anyway, cardiovascular disease. So now I'm going to show you the randomized control trials. If you're going to say something causes heart disease or diabetes, you have to have a randomized trial that proves it.
You can't just say, oh, well, look, oh, people who eat a bit more meat seem to, in the last 50 years, have a little bit more diabetes. That's associational data. It's worthless. It means absolutely nothing. So I'm going to show you the randomized control trials that show that meat causes any problem. And they've done them. They've done animal models, they've done some human. But now I'm going to show you the results from them. Here they are. You ready? Whoa. I'm going straight on to broccoli. Look at all that evidence. That's it. There is no data. And when the trials to show that meat was bad, which they seemed desperate for the last 30 years to somehow prove, when they failed and they couldn't get evidence, they kind of began to half make it up with mouse experiments injected with tumours. They literally put their finger on the scales to bias it, and it still wasn't convincing. So they basically just decided, we'll just keep saying it. And essentially, that sounds harsh, but that's essentially what's happened. If you saw the studies, right, that are put in the World Health Organization report to come out and say meat causes cancer, a bunch of associational data of near worthless value. And that's just the way it is. So, and no, anytime they tried to prove it with an experiment that can prove something, it failed. So they just started ignoring them. And this is essentially it. Blood insulin is not useful, and I'm conscious of time now. Here is a list of the primary drivers of coronary vascular disease, and to be honest, Alzheimer's and many other issues as well, diabetes. Up the top is hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, high blood glucose, spikes in glucose, aggravated by refined carbohydrate vegetable oils. You Google insulin resistance and a disease of your choice, and you're going to see thousands of studies in the last 30 years. It is huge, and no one's talking about it. Still talking about cholesterol. There are other drivers as well, some of which are more linked to genetics, but these things are the main drivers. And very briefly, a study a couple of years ago by a mathematical and medical team, basically they looked over the last 40 years of human trials and said, what factors would most reduce heart attacks if we fixed them? And insulin was top of the heap at 42% of heart attacks could be eliminated over a decade if you fixed everyone's insulin down lower. So it won. I mean, it won outright. And how many of you know that insulin's the biggest reason for heart disease? You know? They then looked and said that systolic blood pressure, low HDL cholesterol, and BMI were the next winners, that each could contribute hugely. But you know what? These are all intimately related to hyperinsulin and insulin resistance. This whole red pie is all related to insulin, right? But the team didn't realize that, in fairness to them, right? But low HDL is insulin resistance. Blood pressure is mostly, as Dr. Unman published recently, and we know, is related to insulin resistance. These things are all together. LDL got a miserable little 16, and you know what? LDL also goes up with insulin problems, especially in younger men. So to be honest, it basically got nothing. Study here, 7 years, men who had a heart attack, followed for 7 years to see would they have a second one. And they found out that their cholesterol over the 7 years had no link whatsoever to the chances of them having a second heart attack, which is a big deal. Second heart often takes you out. No relationship between bad cholesterol or total cholesterol to whether or not they'd have a second heart attack. It had a risk ratio of 1, meaning it didn't matter whether it was high or low. Blood pressure doubled your chance of having a second heart attack, the men who had higher blood pressure. But most high blood pressure is a function of insulin resistance. High insulin, did it predict like 3 or 4 times more likely to have a second heart attack? 7 times more likely. These are just blood measurements. You know? 7 times more likely. Who's talking about this? I mean, to me, like 7 years ago, within a few weeks, I realized this was the center of the heart disease universe. And 7 years of research, nothing's changed. Who's talking about it? The NHS, you won't even be allowed to get an insulin measurement, effectively. Doctors will say, insulin, if you got diabetes, why do you want insulin? No one knows. So this is the world we live in. So blood insulin is not useful, no need to measure. NHS won't do it. Doctors in Ireland won't want to do it. Is that true? No. It's completely wrong. I've just shown you it's wrong. It's the most important measure of all. I'm going to skip diabetes here in the interest in time, and it's a bit heavy. And I'm going to tell you though, you think 9% of UK people are now type 2 diabetic, and that's diagnosed. But if you measured them with insulin measurements, which they never do, you would find a ton more type 2 diabetics using proper post-meal insulin. That's what diagnoses. No one does it. 64% of US adults over 45 are now pre-diabetic or diabetic. That's just measuring glucose. Pre-diabetic, diabetic, insulin-resistant, hyperinsulinemic, all these words, they're all the same thing. They just confuse you. 64% of US adults in this nutrition survey data, which I pulled, are now essentially type 2 diabetic. And if you measure them with insulin measurements, especially after a meal, you probably pick up another 10%. Myself, Dr. Gerber, and many experts in this field think probably 3/4 of American adults over 45 are now essentially diabetic physiologically. You wonder where the heart attacks come from. I'll show you on that point. EuroAspire study is in Europe, and a friend of mine, Dr. Scott Murray, he's a cardiologist in Liverpool, he's a great guy. He loves this study, and I discovered it years ago, and he brought it up last year. So I'll show you. What they did is they went and took 7,000 coronary artery disease patients from 24 countries of Europe, ages 18 to 80. So they basically went out and got everyone who had coronary artery disease, ages 18 to 80, 24 countries. And they got the ultimate sample and decided, let's look at what a coronary artery disease person, what their blood glucose looks like. Let's measure them with a couple of different glucose measurements. So when they measured them, well, first of all, they looked at their records and they realized, oh God, a third of them are type 2 diabetic already. It's on the third of them are type 2 diabetic. Ooh, okay. Well, we'll remove those because we know they're diabetic. So they had 4,000 of the 7,000 left who are non-diabetic. So they said, let's look at their blood glucose and see, you know. Straight away, a third of those they found out were full-blown type 2 diabetic, undiagnosed. Just a glance at their blood glucose. Another third they called high risk for diabetes, but trust me, they are diabetic. They just didn't quite meet the criteria, so they called them high risk, but the reality is the team knew they're diabetic. Another third. And the remaining bunch, they didn't insulin test them. And if you don't insulin test, you're not going to find the other diabetics anyway. So out of the whole lot that they pulled of all heart disease victims, over 3/4 were essentially type 2 diabetic. 3/4 of them. They didn't measure the cholesterol, doesn't matter. Study 3 years ago, 75% of cardiac victims out of 138,000 admitted to US hospitals, 75% of them had a normal or lower than normal LDL cholesterol level. So you're not going to see anything, right, in heart disease victims with cholesterol, as I showed you. But look what you see when you measure the blood glucose. And sometimes I just think it's like a fantasy land. It's insane. So completely wrong. Type 2 diabetes is defined, right, not by blood sugar, but by your blood insulin, high insulin, insulin resistance. And the last one, and I'll finish on this, probably have questions. Low carb or ketogenic diets are not advisable. How many people have seen articles in the paper about low carb might be dangerous? Ooh, higher mortality in this crappy study. Ooh, keto might give you bad breath. There was even keto crotch, where they said that women could have odors from keto. That, we found out, was also indirectly funded by pasta manufacturers through a PR group. And that went out all over the world on one day. There were pictures, and it was misogynistic. It was a disgrace. They don't care. They sat down with a working group in a focus room, and I've been there many times in my corporate career. They sat down and decided, how can we make the biggest negative impact on keto? And the actual dreadful people that they are came up with that. And that shows you who you're dealing with here. Don't be naive about corporates. So, okay, let's have a look at the data. Kraft, my friend who died at 95 last year, or the year before, he did 15,000 people, measured them with insulin, and he proved a lot of what I told you. 15,000 people. But what he used to do in 1972 is he'd get people with this high insulin after a meal response, right? And he'd fix them within 6 months to a nice low insulin, non-diabetic. How did he do it? Low carb diets. In 1973, see the old type low carbohydrate management response. Kraft was doing this in 73 because he's smart and he knows that low carbohydrate fixes diabetes, which he also said fixes most heart disease, because most heart disease is diabetes. 73, right? He's a great man. But me as well, I told you, and it's one person, but that's how you fix the diseases. Metabolic disease that drives heart disease, cancers, you know, Alzheimer's, not exclusively. You fix it with low carb, real food. Virta Health, human trial last year, they took 450 type 2 diabetics. What happened after a year of keto? No drugs, keto, low carb with support from a phone app. 1.3% drop in A1C, which is a huge drop. Weight loss, yeah, that'll happen too. 94% decreased or eliminated their drugs, their insulin. 60% effectively in remission. 60%. And type 2 diabetes, which drives most modern disease, is called a chronic progressive disease. That is the medical dogma. It will progress over time and you will need increasing medications, and that is the way it is. 60% regress their diabetes with just diet, because that's the root cause. It addresses all of the real root causes. That's why it worked. So how do you square that with all the media you see about keto? Well, it's an economic thing, it's a profit thing. It's a serious threat. This study here, just an example, ketogenic diet from Professor Volek, one of my favorite professors. Military personnel. They go in with a keto diet, that's all, randomized, split half the people to a generic diet they were eating, half got keto. And they did not control calories, to a point made earlier. Didn't control calories. No, just eat the right food, don't worry about the calories. Weight down relatively 18 pounds in the people on the keto, military people. Body fat 5%, visceral fat, the fat in your organs that drives disease, that's the important one, down 43%, almost halved their visceral fat in only 3 months. And their insulin resistance, the most important thing of all, which I've told you, down around 30%. That's what fixing root causes, keto or low carb, can do. Okay? It addresses the problem. Low LDL and you know all this stuff, it doesn't address the problem. They missed the boat. ApoE4, here's a person with insulin-resistant dyslipidemia. Serious trouble, right? Early dementia. I think it was a guy in his 50s, but early signs of dementia. They give him a keto diet for 3 months. His insulin resistance and his fasting insulin dropped nearly 90%. 90% down in the most important measures, really, for health. His A1C, or his blood sugar long-term level, came down 30%, and he became non-diabetic from screaming type 2 diabetic in the 3 months. And his MoCA cognitive score, which is the thing they use for, or Alzheimer's and all, it's cognitive scoring, or how diseased or otherwise you are in terms of mental ability, went up 26%, which is a huge jump. And they just went in and did this with a keto diet, with no drugs, nothing else. So you're addressing the root causes. So keto low carb, this is the tip of the iceberg. There are mountains of data, but all the data is out there, but no one wants to know. The media don't want to know. Right? 1917 they knew it. Type 2 diabetes, I've just showed you, is nearly all heart disease victims, type 2 diabetic, biggest disease process in the world. Back here in 1917, they had a simple fix for type 2 diabetes. The allowed foods, all the real foods I told you about. Strictly forbidden foods, sugars, farinaceous, that's floury foods, wheats, flour, starches, puddings, flour, bread, biscuit, blah, 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 rice, blah, blah, blah. This lady, Rebecca Oppenheimer, wrote the perfect intervention for the modern disease epidemic in 1917. That's over 100 years ago. Right? She was correct. That's it. It's not a panacea, it's not magic, it won't make the weight disappear. It'll help you a lot, and it will begin to normalize your metabolic disease markers. So, wrong. So at the end of the day, that's only 6, but if I was going to do a report card on these 6, and these are a big deal, each of these 6 is really huge, it's important, they're not small things. These 6 are big deal, and they underpin the modern disease epidemics. They're a big deal, and millions are suffering, and millions are having heart attacks. So these are big, and how did they do? What can I say? That's it. Sorry guys, you had hundreds of billions of dollars, you had 50 years, and sorry, on 6 big ones, you made an absolute mess of it. And it's just the truth. It's just the way it is. I mean, I wouldn't like to be them when their mammy gets them with a report card like that. So a bit of levity. But essentially, that's it. And, you know, the answers are CAC, know your score and track it. Middle age, middle risk is in the guidelines. Know your risk and take action. Cholesterol key cause, it's a distraction largely. It has a part to play, and if your cholesterol jumps up on a new diet, it may be indicating there's a problem, but you need a lot of expertise to find out why. It's not just bad cholesterol. Meat causes cancer, diabetes, get out and walk, don't make me laugh. Reject bad science, eat nutrient-dense, traditional, real foods. And if that includes balanced meat as part of a balanced diet, or organ meats or superfood, of course, you're not going to get nutrition from the ovaries of grasses, grains. You know, they have to fortify all those foods. Why do they fortify all the grain foods? Because they have no value in them otherwise. That's why they don't fortify liver. Liver fortifies you. Okay, blood insulin is not useful. NHS won't measure it. Everyone in England is saying, I can't get an insulin measurement. No, insulin is crucial. Respect your insulin is the phrase we have. It's the most important measure along with glucose of the generic blood measures. Type 2 diabetes defined by blood sugar? Absolutely not. Insulin defines type 2. So lower your insulin to resolve type 2 diabetes. How do you lower your insulin? You lower your insulin by stop eating crappy refined carb sugars, wheats, processed foods. Eat real foods. Your insulin will drop like a stone. And low carb or ketogenic diets are not advisable. That's obviously absurd. Healthy low carb and or keto approaches are a technical engineering approach that's perfectly suited to a modern population that is riddled with chronic disease, that requires lowering refined carbohydrate sugars and eating real foods. That's what's needed, urgently required. So that's it. If you understood all this and you told people about it and did it yourself, well then you would get a great report in my book. Right, that's it. Questions?
Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see my subscribe button in the middle of the screen, a free viewing of the Widowmaker movie on the far right, and myself and Dr. Gerber's book, Eat Rich, Live Long, on the left. Otherwise, please do subscribe to the audio podcast. Thanks.